Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ania and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we have an update on the Ukraine crisis. We're talking about regressive potential bills in the UK Parliament and some very, very shocking statements from FIFA's president. First up, the US has rejected Russia's demand to bar Ukraine from NATO, a key demand in its proposal to resolve the ongoing crisis in that region. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken provided the formal response in coordination with NATO, offering no concessions but claiming the US was offering a serious path forward. The Kremlin, meanwhile, has said that its concerns have not been addressed, but that it would not respond hastily either. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also added that it gives hope for the start of a serious conversation on secondary questions. Envoys from Moscow and Kiev have agreed to a fragile ceasefire in the eastern part of Ukraine in talks in Paris and to keep dialogue ongoing. Prashant is on the show now. Prashant, no concrete moves, but at least these what seem to be delaying tactics indicate that no one wants a further escalation of this conflict.
Right, Siddharth, it's a bit of a mixed bag, for lack of a better word, because on the one hand, like you said, we do have the United States did respond. Like you said, there are possibilities of talks continuing, of course. But the key fact remains that the key demands of the Russians have not been met. And the US, like you said, the US saying that they're going to keep the expansion of NATO open-ended, which was perhaps Russia's number one concern. And of course, we don't know the exact details that are there in these answers. These are just indications that both countries are given. For all you know, there may be a little more subtlety, a little more nuance in the answers, which are not going to come out in the official declarations per se. So that remains to be seen. Both the US and NATO have responded, but I think the key element, at least in the public-facing discussions as of now, seems to be that it is very much status quo in terms of both sides sticking to their stance. Now, this is a bit unfortunate because there's one positive, hopeful thing, which is that the secondary aspects continue to be in place. Secondary aspects include issues like the deployment of missiles and troops and military exercises, for that matter. There might be a bit more scope for discussion, or there might be a bit more possibilities of discussion on this, say, whether intermediate nuclear missiles should be posted. What could be the conditions by which military exercises take place? There's this situation of prior notification, so to speak.
Right.
So all those, maybe, there's a bit more scope for discussion. But I think on the fundamental issue of the NATO itself, there is no real clarity. In some ways, like we said, this is, like we discussed earlier, this was kind of expected because the United States and NATO cannot really commit to saying that we will not take in Ukraine and Georgia, which are the two countries which are contentious. Although for all practical purposes, it is clear that they're not going to take Ukraine and Georgia anytime soon.
Right.
So, that's a bit of a conundrum in which I think various countries have found themselves, the United States and NATO not willing to sort of, make concrete what is perhaps a de facto position.
De facto anyway.
Yeah, right. So, but they do not want to make it concrete because it will probably mean such a death blow to the alliance after Afghanistan that they don't really want to, sort of take those, make that kind of a stand. Although that's really the reality on the ground. So, right. How the various players are going to negotiate around this is, I think, the fundamental question. We'll probably have to wait and see. Like you said, important thing to note again, the fact that the United States continues to talk about war. Nobody else is really talking about war, but the United States is, and maybe some European powers are. So hopefully, we have peace continuing and the talk of war coming down.
Prashant, you rightly mentioned the key players in the scenario, which also extends to beyond Europe. China also coming out and conveying to the US that it needs to take Russia's security concerns seriously. What are the implications for the world beyond just Europe?
Well, I mean, before coming to that, I'll just sort of add to the other point, which is regarding the fact that a very interesting series of talks that took place between Russia and Ukraine that you mentioned, where they decided to continue the ceasefire. Now, It's important to note that these talks took place in Paris. They were part of this discussion mechanism in which there's Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine. And the fact that, there was talk of ceasefire, and despite all this rabble-rousing that's taking place is actually quite significant. Because one thing it indicates that, Germany and France, like we've mentioned before, are specifically not very keen on, conflict
any kind
breaking
of conflict.
out. Exactly, because of the energy situation, because of the disruption, the large-scale disruption that is definitely going to take place, which the countries of Europe are going to be affected the most. So definitely they are two countries which really don't want. So it's interesting that this round of talks also taking place in parallel. Another round is going to talks is going to take place in February as well. So that's the only important thing to keep in mind. The other important thing, of course, is that yesterday various Ukrainian officials did make it a point to say that they did not believe that war was imminent. At the same time, when the US is going to go talking about war in a minute, that's also an important thing to note. But coming to your larger question on the global implications, I think it's a very serious moment right now because we see an entire, there are possibilities of this extending to Latin America, for instance, because Russia has talked about further military relations with countries in Latin America. There is a strong chance that in China is going to be affected as well. Central Asia is going to be affected. Central Asia already in a very destabilized position because of Afghanistan. So keeping all these things in mind, I think what we are seeing is that this is a very, very crucial domino, so to speak, and it's very imperative that war not break out, any kind of conflict not break out, because I think the implications to the west, to the south, to the east, everywhere are going to be catastrophic. So it's one thing for the United States and far away in the Atlantic to sort of stir tensions like this, but this whole interconnected region that is Eurasia is actually facing a massive threat right now because of so many competing interests, multiple areas, multiple fragile areas of weakness, and one conflict could actually spark all of these into spark many more conflicts as well.
Thanks for that update, Prashant. Next up, we're going to the United Kingdom, where, as we've talked about before, of course, the Conservative government has been launching an all-out attack on people's fundamental rights through a series of regressive bills on policing, the right to protest, voting, immigration, legal proceedings, and so on. These attacks on rights have been met with massive opposition, with broad sections of British society taking to the streets across the country. People's Dispatch spoke earlier with Asad Rahman, the Executive Director of War on Want, who spoke on the implication of these bills, especially on the most marginalized communities in the UK, as well as the hypocrisy of the British ruling class. Let's listen to an excerpt of that interview.
So we have, of course, and are still in the midst of the corona pandemic. We have one of the highest death tolls relative in the world. Over 170,000 people have lost their lives over the last couple of years. We've got a huge cost of living crisis of poverty and inequality. We have over 4.5 million people relying on food banks in this country. Many people who are in work poverty, so they are working but not making enough to either heat their homes or feed their families. So, I mean, actually, there's a series of bills that have been going through Parliament at this time. So there is this very controversial police and crimes bill. Its actually full title is the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. It's a huge package of measures, very, very draconian, and I'll speak about that in a moment. We have a Nationality and Borders Bill going through Parliament. We have attempts by the government to limit judicial reviews. So this is the right of people to take the government to court when people feel that their rights have been ignored or overturned by legislation. We have just voted through, Parliament has just voted through a new voter ID bill, which will make it incumbent on people to show voter IDs before they can vote. We have very, very little instance of voter fraud in the UK, but we have about 4.5 million people who don't have a photo ID with them. Overwhelmingly, of course, working class people, black and in the black community. And this is seen as a whole scale attempt at basically gerrymandering who can and who won't be able to vote. We also have a threat to roll back the Human Rights Act, which is our piece of legislation which governs and guarantees our rights here in the UK, and also the government threatening to make illegal the right to boycott. Of course, this is for two reasons. One, to try and attack the right, and it's part of the continuing onslaught on those who advocate for the rights of the Palestinian people. They want to make the call for BDS illegal, to take away the right of local authorities and institutions to adopt boycott, divestment or sanctions proposals. And of course, it won't be just affecting issues around Palestine. It will also be hugely impactful on, movements working around climate and climate justice and trying to take action against the fossil fuel industry. But just talking about the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill, it's fundamentally a huge bill, which really their goal is to restrict our right as citizens to be able to hold the government to account, and fundamentally our right to protest. And what's happened is there's been the bill itself, the existing bill that was put forward by the government, gave the police incredible new powers, like basically about when, how, where, and even how many people are allowed to protest. I mean, it's and breaching that, causing so-called serious annoyance, has huge custodial sentences up to 10 years. There is a fundamental attack on the right of gypsy and traveller communities in their way of living. It's making it basically a criminal offence for you to reside in a vehicle, and if you cause distress. And these terms are so vague. So basically, it allows the right just to say, well, that traveller site is causing me distress. And of course, we know that disproportionate and racist policing disproportionately affects both Gypsy, Roma, traveller, and of course the Black communities. Massive new expansion of suspicionless stop and search powers. These were powers that the police used to have and enact on a daily basis. When I was growing up and part of the Black movement, they were our fight. They were what sparked the uprisings in 1981 and 84, which was just literally the police stopping and searching every young Black person and every person of colour. We are seeing legislation and clauses that will basically allow the police to take our personal data from agencies. So your political affiliations, your religious belief, your health, they will be able to do that. They'll be able to make individual profiles of you. And we can already see from what the government has done in terms of the gang matrix. It has this so-called predictive using of data to have predictive policing, and overwhelmingly something like 72% of the people on this matrix are Black, and yet only 27% of those people involved in gangs and involved in violence are Black. So we can already see that this will be disproportionately affecting the Black community.
FIFA boss Gianni Infantino presented his organization's proposal to the Council of Europe yesterday, trying to convince the most powerful players in world football that hosting the FIFA Men's World Cup every 2 years, rather than quadrennially as it has been since 1930, is in the wider interests of the game. The idea is largely opposed in Europe and South America, but enjoys close to unanimous support from FIFA's 54 African member associations. It was all the more shocking that parts of the speech that Infantino made was downright racist, and in the words of Ronan Evian, Executive Director of Football Supporters Europe, went to the extent of instrumentalizing death in the Mediterranean to sell his megalomaniac plan. Senior journalist Sharda Ugra is with us now on the show. Sharda, good to have you on Daily Debrief. Before we get into some of the more horrifying aspects of what Infantino has said, which of course predictably he then said was misconstrued or taken out of context and all of that, why is FIFA trying so hard to sell this 2-year World Cup plan?
According to me, Siddhant, it's fundamentally about revenue earnings, because that is, the biggest television rights that you can get internationally. I think across sport, which includes the Olympic Games, multi-nation, multilateral. And you have it every 2 years. There's more money in FIFA's bank every 2 years. As for the fact that there is great support of the African nations, remember, it's the support of the people that run federations in African football, and we know what people who run federations are like everywhere in the world. So everyone wants to carve up their own little piece of pie and their own little build their treasure chest. And Europe's reasons are financial, as well as are the reasons of the African nations that are supporting this, because it means more income to them. What happens to the income after that, how it gets funneled out, how it's used in various grassroots programs, that of course is all up in the air.
Right. So Europe then, it's safe to assume UEFA, which is of course makes more regular profits than FIFA does, is opposed to this then, because they will lose out on that chunk of revenue that will go over to FIFA.
Yeah, exactly. Because what happens, and where it will be held, when it will be held, which countries will host it, will it upset the European football season, which is where a lot of UEFA's earnings from clubs or however else that whole financial channel works. All that gets disrupted, which is what's going to happen in Qatar this year. And you've seen that the opposition to staging the World Cup in Qatar was huge, because you sort of upset the season, the European football season, the club season. And
because it's a Winter World Cup, right?
Yeah, because it's a Winter World Cup, and winter is when you have all kinds of when Europe plays its football. So it upsets an old formula, and as far as a new formula goes, it doesn't tell you anything other than the fact that FIFA is going to get more money, and how and it's going to basically carve up that time as well, whether it's held, say, even if it's held in the summer of in the European summer, it's still taken away from a lot of the time, and you're kind of compressing the amount of time that clubs can use to play their own, to have their own calendars worked out, because the biggest clubs in the world are in Europe, the richest, the most secure, the most financial, who want to hold on to their players as well. So it's completely a financial model that they worked on, and they're trying to sell it in various other guises as being, globalization of football and much other quite horrifying sort of stuff that was said by Mr. Infantino.
I'm going to cheekily also take this opportunity to invite you onto our other show where we can talk about some of those implications that also might be felt by the Olympic movement and the Olympic Games, because they also have a similar 4-year cycle, so there'll be some conflict there. But moving on now to the shocking parts of this presentation or this speech. Here's a white European addressing the Council of Europe, talking ostensibly in humanitarian terms, in terms of giving hope to the continent of Africa and all of that. But going on to say some things that not only does it trivialize, Sharda, what these refugees and asylum seekers, the kind of desperation they face and the hardships that they go through to get where they are, but it also kind of tries to balance out the loss of revenue from that this might have on Europe, by somehow saying that less migrants will end up on your shores, so it'll be balanced out in some way. It's bizarre.
It is so weird. When I first heard it, I thought it was a satire or something of that kind, because you would not expect someone so senior in sports administration, or maybe you would actually in global sports administration, to be speaking in these words. You are trivializing what is a like you yourself said, what is an enormous tragedy that happens. Why are people leaving? It's not that football players are trying to storm the shores. What is this? What is this discussion that you're having? And it's almost gone back to a colonial sort of few hundred years ago. Ours is a football empire, and we're out to save the world from itself. It was, of course, he now tries and back. It said that this is all done in the goodness of heart. But who was checking his speech? Was nobody checking what he was saying? Doesn't he have a speech writer? You fire the speech writer, whatever it is. It was an absolutely ghastly thing to hear, particularly when organizations like this and their heads are extremely careful about the words that they use for anything. We're seeing what's happening about the Winter Olympics in China, and so they are so careful with this. And here Mr. Infantino has just gone and stepped into a puddle of what, by talking absolutely trivializing something that is a very serious issue, and talking so contemptuously and so patronizingly about one big chunk of the world.
Absolutely. All right, Shada, that's all the time we have today. Thank you very much for joining us today. So a wrap on the show for this afternoon. From me and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you very much for watching. You can get more on all of these stories from our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.